He's an alumnus of the Department of History, University of Delhi. Professor Menon is a Mellon Chair. Professor Menon is a Mellon Chair of Indian Studies and the Director of the Center for Indian Studies in Africa at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa. He got his PhD from the University of Cambridge and also a Master of Literature from the University of Oxford. He wrote some notable books like Caste, Nationalism, and Communism in South India, Malabar, 1900 to 1948, Cultural History of Modern India. This book is followed by students to study about modern India, and The Blindness of Insight and Caste. He also translated Poduri Kunnamul's 1893 Malayalam novel Saraswati Vijayam into English. Professor Menon is closely associated with Routledge publication, and he wrote Oceanic Method, Thinking with Maritime, and Changing Theory, Concepts from Global South for Routledge publication in 2022. His areas of research are in the broad fields of world literature, cultural history, and cultural anthropology. He taught at the University of Delhi from 2001 to 2009, and prior to this, he also taught at the University of Hyderabad. He Oceanic histories and epistemologies of Global South. His research from the past decade focused on issues like caste, socialism, and equality in modern India. In February 2021, Professor Menon conducted a session for Thinking Aesthetic Production, an online workshop hosted by Kochi Binal Foundation. It discussed the cultural production in Global South, where he himself presented the first session. Professor Menon has worked collaboratively with scholars from Asia, Africa, and Latin America to develop a conceptual vocabulary for the social services, the traditions of intellection in these spaces. He works with idea of para-coloniality, of what always exceeded the colonial encounter in the making of modern world. Professor Dalit Movement has been awarded the prestigious Falling Walls Award for his transnationalism research. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me at Deshbandhu College. Having formerly taught at Delhi University, I have a particular affection for returning to Delhi, and this has been because of COVID, it's been difficult to actually visit the city. So this is as good an occasion as any to visit a college, even if virtually. And thank you, Abhishek, for putting up with me, because the session has had to be postponed at least once because of, again, because of COVID and illness at home and so on. So I'm glad to be here. What I'll do today is try and speak for around 40 to 45 minutes, if that's all right. And then we can have questions. The lecture, as I told Abhishek, is pegged at a largely undergraduate audience, because I'm assuming that most of the people attending the talk will not be familiar with research and much of the literature around these issues of oceanic history, global epistemologies, and so on, which I engage with. So the topic of today's talk is Nations and Nationalism, Thinking with the Ocean, or From the Ocean. And this becomes a crucial theme to think with, since most of what we study as the history of modern India, or even of India as a country, is very terrestrial. It speaks about histories on the land. And there are political and other implications of this terrestrial histories, which I shall go into. And so one of the reasons for the call to study histories of India from the ocean is also to direct our attention to the larger geographies that India has always been part of and continues to be part of. One of the things that is important in all of this is our worship of the idea of the map. Right? The map is our secular deity, the map of the nation, as it were, stretching from the Himalayas to Kanyakumari and from Gujarat to the states of the Northeast. And there is an inheritance of cartography or map making that we need to take very seriously when we look at the way we study history, in which we do. So we are familiar with ideas like the Radcliffe line, the McMahon line, the Durand line, these lines that Amitav Ghosh would have called shadow lines drawn in the dust by our colonial masters, which create the separations between India and Pakistan, India and China, between Pakistan and Afghanistan, and so on. And if one again thinks about the ways in which we study history in school and the school historical atlas, so to speak, from around 1757 to 1947, what you have is a kind of accretion of the acquisitions by an imperial state of territory and a growing sense of the spread of empire over what we now know as the map of India. And in one sense, it is that map, the territory that is carved out by the British Empire, which is then handed over to the nationalists as a patrimonial inheritance. So there is an inherent irony in the fact that nationalists have begun to worship the lines drawn by colonial powers in the dust. And this is an irony that we need to think about very seriously, which has also created a limiting of our imagination in terms of our understanding of the space of what we see as India. So we have this idea of a succession of empires from the Maurya through to the Mughals, to the British Empire, and then subsequently the emergence of the Indian state. And much of our historiography has reflected the nationalist desire for states. So in combating the colonial discourse that India was just a mere collection of multiple petty principalities, kingdoms warring with each other before the British brought unity, there has been an assiduous search for states in the past or empires in the past, which is in one sense, Romila Thakur's book on Ashoka and the Decline of the Mauryas was a book that is a seminal text in many ways because it spoke about the first empire that India had, right? The first time the idea of India seemingly emerged. Then you have the kind of ideas of republics. So in India, much of our historiography was a provision or addressing this question of a lack. Did we have states? Did we have empires? Did we have republics? Did we have bureaucracies? So those of you who have read Nilakanta Shastri's book on the Cholas, for example, it would appear that India had the Indian civil services much before the British invented it. I mean, there's a kind of Byzantine bureaucracy that Shastri speaks about with the Cholas created. So in that sense, a lot of our historiography has been land-centered, and it's also been driven by the desire to show that we've had what the colonial powers consistently reminded us that we didn't have, that we had empire states, republics, bureaucracies, and so on. And one of the things that when we begin to study modern India, we begin to study the land settlements, right? So we study the permanent settlement, the Rayatwari settlement, the Mehelwari settlement, and all of you are familiar with it. This is the stuff of undergraduate history courses. And one of the interesting things in all of this is the fact that the entire history of India, again, comes to be centered not only on land and the rooting of people and land, the claiming of revenue, the spread of control over land, and so on, but it also writes the history of India in terms of the colonial settlement with upper caste landed groups, right? So if one thinks about that vast history of movement that preceded colonialism, continued during colonialism, and goes on beyond colonialism, the history of the land settlements tries to freeze the idea of the history of India into the settlements made by the colonial power with upper caste landed elite. So there is a closing of the Indian mind that happens and the creation of a landed upper caste imagination as the history of India. And this has led to the kinds of invocations that we have where, so for example, there was a recent debate in which I participated in the Wire, the online journal Wire, where a historian spoke about the idea of India and went back all the way to the Vishnu Purana and said that India has a territory that stretches from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, going back to the classical texts, speaking about Shankaracharya's movement from Kerala to Puri to Badrinath and so on, creating a sacred Hindu landscape. So there is a kind of illusion that moves from the classical Indian texts to the creation of a largely Hindu landscape of India, And what we have is a historiography that does not get its feet wet, right? There is a way in which our historiography is land-centered and does not step beyond these boundaries that have been given to us, first by classical Hindu texts and then by a certain kind of colonial dispensation. Now, just to move to an anecdote, right? When I studied as an undergraduate in Delhi University, one of the things that struck me is that we were never taught South India, right? I mean, South India was an idea, right? We were never taught that. So we studied entirely the histories of East India, Northern India, and so on. And I remember asking my lecturer at that point at St. Stephen's, so why is it that we never study South India? And then I was told, South India is in February, which was a very strange answer. What it actually meant was that, look, by the time we get to February, there is no time to teach South India because then we have to rush for the examinations and so on. So this historiography that refused to get its feet wet stopped with the Indo-Gangetic landscape and never extended to studying a history of southern India, which would have meant looking at the histories of the ocean, right? That the south of India has always been part of the larger oceanic landscape of the Indian Ocean. And particularly if one thinks about the Cholas and their seaborne empire, and we have to at all understand the fact that India had a profound influence on Southeast Asia. We are all aware of Angkor Wat, Borobudur, the prevalence of Mahabharata and Ramayana texts in Southeast Asia. How did this happen? This happened through this migration outwards from India, through empire, through trade, through the movement of labor. And so, for example, when I visited Japan, it was for me one of the interesting things to go to a Saraswati temple, right, called Benzai Ten in Japan. And again, one thinks about our most important industrial house, the Tatars. The fortunes of the Tatars were built up in the opium trade with China, right? So suddenly, when you begin to think about the ocean, you realize how much of an impact India has had in terms of the movement outwards and engagement with other geographies, as well as the impact of other geographies on India. And this was put forward with great clarity by Fernand Braudel. Some of you may be familiar with the great French historian Fernand Braudel and his 3-volume History of Capitalism. And one of the things that he spoke about was that if you conceive of India as a quadrilateral, for example, right, rather than working from the Himalaya to Kanyakumari kind of perspective, the southwestern coast of India is integrated through the Indian Ocean with the Middle East, with Europe, and all beyond to Bahia, Brazil, the northern part of South America. If you look at the southeastern coast, the Coromandel coast is integrated with Southeast Asia, China. The northwest of India is integrated with the Ottoman and the Safavid empires. The northeast of India is integrated with Burma, Malaya, China, and the northern parts of Asia. So once we kind of look at the map inside out, as it were, we begin to see that India is part of a much larger geography through which people, materials, ideas, and so on have traversed. So coming from where I do, and the fact that since South India was regarded as being in February and therefore never taught to undergraduates, coming from Kerala, I began to wonder, why is it that the ocean was never really engaged with? And so what would it mean to write history from the seaside, right? What would it mean to write history from the seaside in Bengal, in Orissa, in Tamil Nadu, in Kerala, and so on? And how do we move beyond the land settlements and the landed imagination that confine us to the cartography and the map that I spoke about? Interestingly enough, what I began to see when I looked more at the history of Kerala, there was the puzzle of how the sea does not figure very much in the literary and the aesthetic imagination. So in literature, for example, and as I spoke with friends who were in Bengal, spoke with friends who were in Orissa, and most of them said, well, there's a similar phenomenon there, that you have literature and films that deal with the river, but very little with the sea. And in some sense, this is a consequence of the turning inwards that happens as a result of the land settlements of the 18th century, which create a dominant upper caste landed imagination. And this is the idea that then permeates throughout our sensibilities in South Asia. On the other hand, it is not without significance that those historians of India who have indeed worked on the ocean have come largely from Kerala and Bengal. So you have Sardar K.M. Panikkar, who wrote a great book on the influence of the sea in Indian history. And of course, the prominent early historians of the Indian Ocean, Ashin Dasgupta, K.N. Chowdhury, who set up Indian Ocean studies. One of the things that we need to think about is why the sea is forgotten even amongst people who live by the sea. And there's a very interesting Australian anthropologist called Greg Denning, who wrote about the histories of Australia. And one of the things, I mean, most of you are familiar with the idea that Australia initially was populated by convicts who were sent out to colonize, right? English convicts who were sent out to colonize this territory. It was a form of exile, exiling these convicts to a territory in which they would redeem themselves through labor. Now, of course, Australia was seen as a terra nullius, or as a blank space. Of course, there were indigenous inhabitants there who bore the brunt of the violence of these white settlers. So Greg Denning asked the question, if the ocean was so central, so foundational to the history of Australia, surely there ought to be a greater reflection of the ocean in the ways in which Australia imagines itself. And one of the things that he points out is that when you look at Australian ideas of the ocean, Australian sensibilities regarding the ocean, it largely relates to questions like surfing, bronze bodies inhabiting the beach, rather like Baywatch in the US, right? Because there is something about the history of the ocean that speaks to the history of colonization. It speaks to the history of the brutality that occasioned white presence in Australia. So it's, in some sense, it is forgotten or elided. When I started working on the history of Kerala, again, this question was the puzzle at the back of my mind. Why is it that Malayalis living by the sea didn't think very much about the sea? And as I began reading more and more, what struck me is that there were outliers, right? That there were historians, there were literary figures who did engage with it, but they were at the margins of the historical and literary imagination. So, for example, in this book that I'm writing on the history writing in southern India, history writing in Kerala between 1860 and 1950, one of the people I look at is a literary critic called Balakrishna Pilla, who wrote histories. Now, one of the things is we tend to, as historians, be invested with a certain kind of hubris that only historians write history, which is merely a tautology, right? That history is written by historians, and only historians can write history, that the historical imagination is something that circulates through multiple narrative forms, including literature. So when Balakrishna Pilla, who is a literary critic, began writing his history of Kerala, he began with Rome and Babylon. Now, this seems hugely eccentric, right? To write a history of Kerala, beginning with Babylon. But what Balakrishna Pilla was aware of was the fact that Kerala had been integrated for over 1,000 years with the rhythms of the Indian Ocean. There had been trade with Rome. Kerala had supplied the pepper that went into not only luxury consumption in Rome, but also as tribute that was paid by Carthage whenever it lost in the imperial wars against Rome and so on. So he felt that this was a point to begin. And the question that he raised then has really become, in some sense, a credo for my writing of history, where he asked, is Kerala a chapter in the history of Rome, or is Rome a chapter in the history of Kerala? Now, this is a profound question to think with, because even when we think about empire, very often when we read histories of Britain, India is merely a chapter in the history of British Empire. And we have yet to reach a stage where we see Britain as merely a chapter in the history of India, right? And that is something that is a stance that Balakrishna Pilla adopted at that point as a nationalist stance, as also a historical stance. So the sea comes into this history. One of the most comprehensive attempts to write a history of Kerala in the 1930s was by the lawyer Padmanabha Menon, who wrote 4 volumes on a history of Kerala, in which were really annotations to a series of letters written by a Dutch priest in the 17th century. So in that sense, when he writes the history of Kerala, suddenly Kerala becomes part of a larger maritime landscape that extends to Holland. So for Balakrishna Pilla, Rome comes in. For Padmanabha Menon, it is Holland that comes in. So the sea is ever present in the historical imagination. There is a more conservative historian, someone called Kanipayur, who is a Brahmin, traditional Brahmin intellectual who was interested in Vastu Shastra. And he begins to write a history of Kerala in the 1950s and 60s. And he is concerned with the idea of the Aryan immigration, that the Brahmins had come from Central Asia into India. Interestingly enough, for him, the Brahmins travel by sea from Central Asia. So they come down to the coast and then they travel by sea to Kerala, because he's convinced that if they had come through land, they would have got polluted through interaction with natives along the way and so on. So he wanted to maintain an essential purity, that they came as they were. So in these histories, seemingly eccentric, but fundamental to it is the idea that those who live by the sea cannot escape the sea in their imagination. Now, one of the things when one thinks about all of this is that we are faced with a number of cliches when it comes to thinking about the ocean. So, for example, we have the idea that, Kala Pani, or the idea of Kala Pani, that a lot of Indians resisted traveling across the ocean. And the question to be asked is, when does the idea of Kala Pani begin to have an influence on the Indian imagination? Because as early as the 11th century, there are settlements of Brahmins and merchants in Southeast Asia. We have enough evidence of this, which reflects a larger migration into Southeast Asia, the idea of Greater India, as it then came to be called. And that's another whole terrain which I shan't go into. But this question of a thalassophobia, or fear of the sea, as Sanjay Subramaniam puts it. So when did this idea of Kala Pani come about? And one of the answers, and interesting answers, has been provided by Seema Alavi, who teaches at Delhi University and has now moved on, who did her PhD on the East India Company Army in Bengal. And one of the things that she pointed to was that the East India Company Army in 18th century in Bengal was concerned with recruiting largely upper caste groups, Brahmins and Rajput groups. And very often people presented themselves as Brahmins and Rajputs in order to get recruited into the East India Company Army. So there was a dialectic in the relation between caste and the East India Company Army's own suppositions. And one of the things that she points to is that there were a whole number of measures that were put into place in the army. Separate pots were provided because the Brahmins refused to eat from other people's hands. They wanted to cook their own food. Even Brahmin prostitutes were supplied to the Brahmin soldiers. And interestingly enough, at the time of the Burma campaign, which is in the early part of the 19th century, one way in which the soldiers refused to go was they said that we as Brahmins refuse to cross the sea because there are strictures against our crossing the sea, against crossing into Kala Pani. So this is the way in which the discourse enters the East India Company discourse about indigenous conceptions of space, territory, prohibitions, and so on. So there were a number of mutinies that happened with regard to the Burmese campaign. And once this idea becomes set in, you find this idea being invoked more and more. This is not to say that this is the origin of the idea, right? That's not what I'm arguing here. I'm saying that we need to historically locate as to when this thalassophobia began to set in, right? And this is one historical location where we can actually trace it. And then you begin to see that this has multiple instances then begin to emerge, so that even when Gandhi wants to go to study in England, the community objects, his immediate community objects, because again, remember, we tend to think about Gandhi, in largely within leftist discourse as a banya, right? We tend to think of, but it's important to remember that Gandhi came from a patrician class, right? His father, his grandfather were divans to princely states. So he came from a patrician class. And so the idea of Kala Pani was something that was very prevalent among the upper caste, among the Brahmins and the upper caste. Labor didn't have the choice, right? If you were a lower caste laborer, you went to work where you could, whether it was the ocean, the desert, the mountains, it didn't really matter. So this is a point that I shall return to, which is crucial to our understanding of both the idea of cartography as well as the thalassophobia, as well as the landed settlements, that very often the history of India, as we know it, has been written from the point of view of the Brahmin and the Kshatriya, of the upper castes. It has not been written from the point of view of the merchant caste or the Shudra and Dalit caste. So part of this landed history which is central to our imagination of the writing of modern India, also reflects the upper caste sentiments of which go into the making of a historical paradigm. If one thinks about the history of religions in India, for example, again, there are any number of cliches that are available to us, right? So when one speaks about the advent of the Muslims in India, very often the story begins with the Arab invasion of Sindh in 711, and then it's a series of conquests that happen, and most of you would know the Ghazni, the Ghoris, the Mughals, and so on and so forth. And this is an idea that then comes to be central to an imperial historiography as well, that India had been subject to a series of Muslim invasions, and that it was the British that actually put an end to it, create Pax Britannica. And this is an idea that has been then taken over by the idea of this constant Muslim invasion is an idea that has been taken over again, ironically, by people who present themselves as Hindu nationalists, who in the present, who remain committed to a colonial historiography. And that's the irony that we live with. Interestingly enough, the very first mosque in India is built in Kerala in 629 AD, right? Around 100 years or so, or slightly over 100 years after the emergence of Islam as a religion by Malik ibn Dinar. The first Christians in India are the St. Thomas Christians who are there from the first centuries AD, owing allegiance to the Antioch in Syria, and Eastern Christianity undergoes many transformations. So you have Christians in Kerala from or along the southwestern coast from the first century AD. The coming of the Portuguese then creates a whole series of conversions of Christians themselves from an affiliation to Syria to an affiliation to Rome, the creation of a Catholic denomination. If you think about the first Jews in India, they come by sea from AD 76 onwards, from after the fall of Jerusalem. And in many senses, when we think about the Indian Ocean and southern India, what we have is a different history of Islam, a history of religion, a history of trade, a history of cooperation and collaboration, which is very, very dissimilar to the kinds of imperial historiography tropes that come to us through the histories of northern India. And what we have is an Arab Sea in many senses, but prior to the coming of the Europeans, an Arab Sea that stretches from the Middle East to Southeast Asia, all the way from Aden through to Malacca, taking in the South Indian Peninsula. And a lot of work of late has begun to look at the space very seriously, including the work of my former Delhi University colleague, Yasser Arafat, on Indian Ocean Islam, as it's called, the circulation of texts, the circulation of religious specialists, the circulation of traders, merchants, political specialists who settle down, creating a landscape that includes not only trade, it includes histories of music, right? Includes a history of shrines, includes a history of marriages, and the creation of the Muslims of Kerala, the Maplas, are born of this interaction between Arab traders and local inhabitants. So what you have is a kind of broader circulation of text, personal goods, and music in this vast Indian Ocean space. And interestingly enough, if one looks at the sonic landscape, right, the sonic landscape of this region, what you have is a space that is inflected by rhythms that come from the Middle East, right, which can be heard in the qawwalis that are sung in Coimbatore, in the Nagaur Sharif, as much as further north, right? And if you go to Ajmer and so on. So there's an entire sonic scape that is built up through these oceanic connections. And you find the circulation of Islam within southern India. The stories are nearly always of Sufis, of commerce, of music, and of those of you who are familiar with the history of the post-Vijayanagar formations in southern India, the Sufi saint Shahul Hamid performing miracles on Achyutappa Nayak of Tanjavur in 16th century. Similarly, just as much as you have the spread of Islam through this Indian Ocean Islam, you have the spread of Hinduism as well, right? Through by sea to Southeast Asia, through trade and through scholarship. And this is the history of the circulation of religions, right, in the ocean, which we need to bring into our understanding of what makes India a secular nation. India is not a Hindu nation. India is a nation comprised of multiple religions. And these multiple religions have come into the space of India through these circulations that have happened through the ocean. And this is something that we need to bear in mind. Sunil Amrit, who's a professor at Yale, has written this wonderful book on the Bay of Bengal and the wide geography, right? So when you look at the Bay of Bengal, it includes, we tend to think about the Indian Ocean as being Indian, right? And the Indian Ocean stretches, there's the Eastern Indian Ocean, the Western Indian Ocean. And if we think about water, waters are continuous. The Indian Ocean water is continuous with the Atlantic and the Pacific and so on. These are geographical hubris or geographical pride that makes us give names to oceans. So for example, the Bay of Bengal is actually continuous with the Eastern Indian Ocean and stretches, right? And so what he talks about through his history of the Indian Ocean, Sunil Amrit talks about the movement of people into Burma, into Malaya. And here is where we also again are reminded of a certain kind of amnesia that comes about through imperial and national historiography. Because if we think about that vast space of the British Empire in its initial stages mapped onto existing geographies and networks of connection. So Aden was a part of that large map of India. Burma was a part of that large map of India. Persia was a part of the large map of India, and so on, right? So you're thinking about a stretch of South Asia that went all the way from Aden through to Malaysia. Now, this is important because when we think about the history of modern India, we are aware of the partition of India. But the partition of India into India and Pakistan is the last of the partitions, right? And this is a wonderful book that is being written by Sam Dalrymple, who is the son of William Dalrymple, called The Five Partitions, where the partition of India in 1947 is one partition. Prior to that, there's been the partition from Burma, the partition from Afghanistan, the partition from Aden, and finally the partition that happens, which creates East Pakistan and Bangladesh, right? So what we're talking about is a much larger geography that extended through the ocean, which then got compressed and curtailed by the formation of the nation into this geographical entity that we now know as South Asia. Again, two anecdotes. Right? And it's important for me, whenever I taught history or whenever I teach history right now, the important question that I've always asked my students to ask is, where am I in the history that I study? Because very often when we study history, it's seen as the sense of abstract processes. So we moved away from studying kings and queens, but again, it's about land settlements and this and that and the rise of nationalism. And so when I was teaching at Delhi University, I had a number of students who were in my class from Manipur, Nagaland, Mizoram, and they asked, where are we in the histories that you're teaching? And it was the same question that I had asked when I started learning history. Where am I in the history that I'm studying? Right? And so over the period that I taught at Delhi University, I began supervising MPhils on the Northeast, on Manipur, on Nagaland, on Mizoram, and so on. So this fundamental question, the subjectivity that drives history, is an important question. And my students who did MPhils and PhDs with me, I told them, so there was somebody from Haryana who worked on folk songs from Haryana, somebody from Bihar who worked on the river Kosi. So for me, this question of the ocean is a deeply personal question, which then creates this larger historiography that I engage with. So two stories. 1942, the Japanese attack Burma. What happens when the Japanese attack Burma? Suddenly, a whole number of Indians from southern India, eastern India, who work in Burma, right? Remember the 5 partitions that I talked about. Right? And Burma was a natural extension of the South Asian subcontinent. When the Japanese attacked Burma, 2 of my uncles lose their jobs because their offices were bombed, and then they begin to walk back. And this is a story that is present in multiple families all over southern India, that the attack on Burma then means the end of a livelihood. Right? People who have migrated in order to send money back to the family. And these 2 uncles then walk back all the way to Kerala. Now, this might seem impossible. I told the story to my children, who being children of historians, immediately went to Google Maps and checked the distance and said, nobody can walk that kind of distance. Right? But the important thing is that they had to, because it was wartime and they had no other option. And then there are many sentimental stories. My grandmother told me of not being able to recognize her brother who appeared to be a beggar at her door, and so on and so forth. That's one story. The second story is 1953. 1953, what happens is that in Iran or Persia, you have a democratically elected government under Mossadegh. But the Americans are interested in the oil, and this is an ongoing story, right? So they don't want Mossadegh to be in power. So they restore the Shah of Iran. So they subvert, the American CIA subverts a democracy and puts in a monarch, right? And creates a monarchy. And then you have a whole history of oppression that follows. So another uncle who had seen Persia as a natural place to be working in comes home, right? That's my maternal uncle. My mother's uncle leaves his job, comes back home, and returns to a life of fairly genteel poverty thereafter, after having made a bit of money. So these 5 partitions are historical features, the excision of the ocean from the imagination, but they're also something that deeply affect me, right? The reason why I began thinking about the ocean is also connected to these histories that are part of the way I am in the world. And this is an important thing to remember whenever one studies history. The important question to ask is, where am I in the history that I study? This is what has occasioned feminist history. This is what has occasioned Dalit history writing. This is what has occasioned the burgeoning of history writing from the Northeast, because the history of India has been written largely as a history of the Indo-Gangetic Plain and nationalism. So there are 2 histories that now we could move on to, and then I will wind up. The first is the history of Indian capital in the Indian Ocean. So if, as I said earlier on, the history of India has been written largely from the point of view of the upper caste of the Brahmin and the Kshatriya, how do we write the history of India from the standpoint of the Vaishya, Shudra, and the Dalit? Right? And the merchant is somebody who's always been given short shrift in the writing of Indian history. And it's important to remember again that I mentioned in passing the Tatars and their involvement with the trade in China, the opium trade in China. But if one thinks about that larger subordination of the Indian economy under colonialism, there is another history that we now need to start writing about and has been written about, but hasn't entered the ways in which we engage and teach history. So what is happening in southern India at that point is that mercantile groups, which have become fairly prosperous, then begin to extend into Southeast Asia. So under the carapace of British colonialism, you have a South Indian capital which is extending across the sea and setting up rice fields in Burma and the rubber plantations in Malaya. Similarly, you have the Gujarati merchants who are moving out towards East Africa. It's a process that happens over 400 years. Why does Gandhi go to South Africa? Because there are already Gujarati merchants there, right? Gandhi is not the first Indian to land there, and it's not an anomaly that he goes there. So there is the large history of Gujarati capital on the western coast and of Tamilian capital on the eastern coast, and the ways in which they have begun to engage in networks of trade that involve cloth, involve slaves, involve production. So when we begin to think about this whole history of nationalism and nations, we have to imagine also not only what we gained, but what we lost in terms of our imagination, right? What does a map do to us? The map becomes the prison house that cuts out, excises other histories, and this is something that we need to think about. This is why when I was an undergraduate, Christopher Bailey's book, Rulers, Townsmen, and Bazaars, was such a profound influence on our generation, alongside subaltern studies, which also happened around the same time, because it returned the idea of the merchant and capital to Indian history. It alerted us to the fact that apart from the histories of states and landed settlements, the histories of the merchant were very, very important, because the merchants always worked with a very large geography, a geography that was not confined to the kind of state formations or the agrarian formations that we were constantly being taught. Finally, I want to think about the history of the labor diaspora, right? And this is something that in Delhi University, Prabhu Mahapatra has spent a lifetime almost working on this. The large migration of the labor diaspora to Fiji, to Caribbean, to Mauritius, and of course to Sri Lanka, to Malaya, Burma, and so on. There's a vast. So with the end of slavery in 1833 and the beginning of indenture, you suddenly have the movement of large numbers of Indians from the dying agrarian spaces of the Indo-Gangetic heartland, as well as from the Madras Presidency outwards. So from these increasingly barren agricultural landscapes prone to famine, the sea becomes a source of escape. And this story has been told beautifully by Amitav Ghosh in his Ibis trilogy, where he talks about the histories of indenture, not only in terms of the coercion. Of course, there was coercion exercised on Indian labor, but a lot of people emigrated to escape caste, to escape gender subjection, and to escape the multiple hierarchies and inequalities that affect Indian life. So the Caribbean and South Africa become the spaces to which this vast Indian labor diaspora goes, escaping the bonds of feudalism, caste, gender, and so on. Now, how do we reintegrate this history into the history of the nation, histories of nation and nationalism? Right? In one way, this has been studied. Right? The large numbers of people have studied the history of indentured labor, the ways in which Indians reproduce or fight against aspects of Indian culture, how songs circulate. So songs in Bhojpuri can be heard in the Caribbean, right? For example, the growth of this miscegenated music, chutney music, soca music, which pick up on Indian rhythms and Caribbean rhythms. We're familiar with a lot of this. But let me just take two stories and the centrality of labor to the making of Indian nationalism. The first is the story that you already know, right? That of Gandhi. Because Gandhi goes to South Africa because he's invited by Gujarati merchants who are already there And Gandhi, who is a patrician, this is a fact that can't be stressed often enough. We tend to think about Nehru as being the coming from a very wealthy bourgeois family, but Gandhi came from a patrician family of divans from the state of Porbandar and Rajkot and so on, who has never experienced labor. Right? So if you read Hind Swaraj, there are a lot of random references to tribals, and there's the complete absence of caste. This is one of the stunning features of Hind Swaraj, that Gandhi has very little discussion of caste in Hind Swaraj because it's not something that was a matter of everyday experience. I mean, to read Ambedkar, it would be difficult not to find mention of caste, because for Ambedkar, caste was an everyday feature of his existence. So Gandhi, the patrician, encounters labor for the first time in South Africa, organizes indentured labor, both Chinese and Indian, right? And this is the important thing to remember, where there is that international presence, which then informs his politics. It is South Africa that makes Gandhi Indian, as the cliche goes, right? He has an awareness of what the space of India is, the space of Indian identity, space of Indian politics is. And he brings that back. But there's another figure, again, from the history of indenture, a man known as Sridhar Balwant Jodhpurkar. Now, all of you, or some of you might think, who am I talking about? He's a figure who comes to be more popularly known as Baba Ramchandra, right? Who founds the Kisan Sabha in the 1920s in Awadh. And Baba Ramchandra spends 13 years in Fiji as an indentured labor. He's actually a Brahmin who goes to work as a laborer. Right? So here again, there's another cliche that we need to question, right? Of Kala Pani and this, that, and the other, and of Brahmins being involved in certain kinds of activity and not others. So he works 13 years in Fiji, experiences the conditions of labor, returns to the Indo-Gangetic heartland, begins to organize peasants. He's the first organizer, in some sense, of peasants in northern India. And interestingly enough, he begins to speak through the idiom of the Ramayana. Baba Ramchandra always carried a copy of the Ramayana. In Fiji, he had utilized the Ram Leela as a way of organizing the workers that he was working with. And in the 1920s, the shift that happens in Gandhi's ideology, because remember, the Champaran Satyagraha, Gandhi it's a series of petitions that he writes to the British government, following on the contacts that he had established while he was studying in England. 1920s, Gandhi's departure and emergence as a peasant leader has a lot to do with his encounter with Baba Ramchandra. And it's Baba Ramchandra's politics of a peasant politics that's informed by the religious literature and landscape of northern India that Gandhi then begins to work with. And suddenly we begin to see a new way of looking at Indian nationalism. And similarly, one can multiply the kinds of examples of the ways in which the ocean finds its way back into India. Let's take another figure, right, written about by Mark Jurgensmeyer, a man who was born in Punjab and then takes the route across the ocean to go work in California. A lot of Punjabis went to work in California in the large orchards that were coming into existence as agricultural laborers. This is a Punjabi who is from the Dalit caste. He finds his way back to India, Swami Achyutanand, and he founds the Adhar movement. The first lower caste movement in India is founded by Swami Achyutanand, who again experiences not only mobility, but anonymity and an experience of what it is to be free through his encounter with the ocean. And I'll end with a final example. All of you know about the histories of the Ghadar party, in the Americas. There is one figure who has always struck me as being a figure who doesn't receive the kind of acknowledgement that he deserves. A lot of you know about the Kumagata Maru incident, and this is my last example, and I'll stop after this. The Kumagata Maru incident, where Baba Gurdit Singh decides to break the law regarding the immigration of Indians into the North American space. And he takes the ship, Kumagata Maru, and travels via the Pacific to Canada. And of course, they're not allowed there. The Indians are not allowed to disembark. They come back to India. There is a kind of firing that happens. Many Indians die. But Baba Gurditt Singh, when he founds the Guru Nanak Steamship Navigation Company, the fundamental question that he raises is that the oceans do not belong to anyone, right? Neither the British, nor the Canadians, nor the Americans, nor the Australians can prevent the free movement of labor. If Indians wish to go to Vancouver, they should be. And he says a phrase which can only be said in Hindi. He says, "Yes, samandar kisi ke baap ka nahi hai." It's a profoundly nationalist statement. It's a statement that actually emphasizes that the oceans have always belonged to human beings and that human beings have found freedom through engagement with the ocean. So I'll stop with that example, and also now to just remind ourselves that we need to think beyond this landed imagination that colors the way in which we think about histories. What does thinking about the history of ocean allow us to do to rethink the nation, rethink nationalism, think about figures like Achyutanand, Baba Ramchandra, Baba Gurditt Singh, the Gadar Party, and the imagination, and to free ourselves from these shadow lines that are drawn in the dust, which have configured our understanding of South Asian history. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your kindful words. So we're on with the question answer session. If anyone has any query, they can write it in the chat box or can raise their hands.
Whatever the format of questions is, I'm open to that. I mean, I'm not sure how you've organized it. People can write in the chat box and I can read it. Or if you have individual speakers speak, that's also fine.
Yes, so it's both ways. It's both ways.
Actually, one of the things about speaking to a series of blank screens is that there's very little empathy that's possible, because it's always, when one was teaching in DU as well, this was the dreaded moment. You said, any questions on the class? And then everybody shrank into themselves and tried to vanish. Sorry, I'm just letting some... Yeah, thank you. That's done.
You can ask your question.
Lady who works at home was just leaving, yes. Yes, please. Ashutosh, you have a question?
Yeah. So, am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible, yes.
Okay. Okay. So, let me submit that I strongly, like your lecture, and I feel really delighted to listen to you. I teach history in the Hindu College. I would like to say one thing that about the migration on foot that you talked about, your maternal uncle and all. I think the younger generation might have experienced this with the lockdown. That how
exactly
for thousands of kilometers people can in distress can walk. I think that's one thing I wanted to just point it out. And secondly, because I have studied medieval India and I worked on Surat. So my question will be a little different from what I heard from you. But I hope you will understand the nature of the question, and I would like to have your comment because you are, of course, an authority on Oceanic site.
I'm an authority on nothing, man. But ask your question.
Yeah. When we look at and we were taught and we studied Mughals, we usually come across with a comment from across the all kinds of historians that who have worked on medieval India, and including Asindas Gupta and all, it was largely received or portrayed as a hinterland empire, Mughal, as a hinterland empire. So my question is, do you accept this tag that it was a hinterland empire? Number one. Number two, if yes, then why did the Mughals, who faced lots of problems from Portuguese, English, later on French also, in some other forms, but from English, yes, they had to fight wars. I mean, Aurangzeb fought wars with the East India Company, if I remember correctly, 1690s, late 80s and early 90s, they were defeated, but they were pardoned. So, why did the Mughals fail to respond to this challenge?
Okay, now this is an interesting set of questions. I mean, the first, of course, was with regard to the lockdown that I think it's an important historical moment in our lives, and in the lives of those who are children, adults who are alive at this point, that we suddenly saw the ways in which the lives of labor are considered incidental to the life of the nation, right? That they were cruelly cut loose, and you had that migration from the west to the east, which was cruel, resulted in the loss of lives and so on and so forth. But this is also part of a larger historical migration that has been happening for 300 to 400 years, the east-west migration and the west-east migration, but that's in its place. With regard to the Mughals, I think we tend to study the Mughals as largely a terracentric empire, right? I mean, that as a landed empire. And this is also the result of a certain historiography that has emphasized, the Jagirs and the land revenue administration and so on. And it is only at the fringes. I mean, one can argue that perhaps Surat was not the Surat emerges as a port under the Mughals, but the contribution of Surat to the larger economy of the Mughals is something that was minimal in many senses. But what would it mean to think about the number of emissaries that came across the ocean to the Mughal courts? How do we begin to engage with that larger cosmopolis that the Mughals created? That the Mughals were the most important monarchs of their time, right, in the world, not only in South Asia, and the oceanic currents that brought in not only the initial emissaries, of whom we have, Bernier and Sir Thomas Roe and a whole host of people that we read about, but also subsequently the Portuguese. Now, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what would it mean to rethink the Mughal Empire through its history, through the history of its engagement with the ocean or the non-engagement with the ocean? And beyond that, I'm not going to comment, because I noticed Professor Harbans Mukhia is also here, and I don't want to tread on terrain on which I have only a secondary information. Perhaps Professor Mukhia might have something more to say. He is the authority on the Mughal Empire. So I will leave it there. The three questions now from Aditya, Umang, and Subrata, in that order. Aditya Pandey. Your hand is up. Are you?
Yes, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible. Yes. I can't see you, though. You're not visible. Please ask your question. We seem to have lost.
Am I audible now?
You're audible, but you're not visible. So you could put your camera on as well so that I can see you.
Sir, I really would want to do that, but there is no option in my mobile where I'm able to, I can't really open my video camera.
It's okay. It's okay. Please ask your question. That's fine. Please ask your question, Aditya.
I am audible. I am visible now. Yes,
Very
sir.
good.
So, sir, good evening, sir. It was delightful listening to you. So one of the questions that I actually while listening to you, I came up with is the fact that uh, the we really tend to define our nation from the north and from Delhi particularly. How is it that like I am a North Indian, but I've lived most of my life in South India. In fact, even in Kerala, my father was posted there. So, how is it that we can, like, as the next generation of historians, how is it that we would be able to come with this new idea of India from the South Indian perspective, uh, in like inculcating all that the Cholas did and all that, like several other dynasties did, because unlike the North, the South was relatively immune from the invasions, at least till the late, like in the late medieval period. So that I feel, and this is my personal opinion, that in the South we have, like, as India, as the culture that we do, we've been able to retain it much more in the North, because obviously when you are invaded so many times and there are so many things going on, obviously there's more influence there than it is on the South. So I think, I'm not sure, I'm really, obviously we are just
No, thank you. Thank you, Aditya, for the. Uh, have you finished your question?
uh,
Have you finished your question?
Yes,
Uh,
sir. I just wanted to know, how is it that as the next generation of historians,
right.
we set out to define our country from the southern perspective, from the perspective of those people who took our culture abroad, instead of like Mauryas. Obviously, they are a big dynasty. Mauryas, the Guptas. Obviously,
Right.
that is a huge part, and we do read that.
Okay. Thank you, Aditya. I mean, I think one of the things that we need to do as a new generation of historians is to ask ourselves what are the cliches that you've inherited from the past. What are the misunderstandings of history that we have inherited from the past? One of the things that I addressed is this question of a terracentric history. Why is it that we write a history minus the ocean? Why does our history writing refuse to get its feet wet? Right? Another kind of question would be to, the other cliche that you've inherited is that North India, having been subjected to multiple invasions, has lost its culture. South India has managed to preserve its culture. And very often in these kinds of assumptions, there is this idea of culture as being an unchanging thing. Right? That there is something like a pure Hindu culture that exists somewhere. And if the purer the Hindu culture gets, the more violent, inegalitarian, and hierarchical it gets. Right? Pure Hindu culture is what led B.R. Ambedkar to write volumes about the existence of the sheer contempt that Hindus have towards one another. So, in that sense, I am not one for valorizing Hindu culture. Right? So that's a second cliche that when we talk, because one of the things that we need to think about again is that in northern India, you find the growth of a culture that responds not only to the challenge of multiplicity, the challenge of multiple cultures. So when you think about somebody like Kabir, who manages to bring together not only the hierarchy, an opposition to the hierarchy that is central to the imagination of Hinduism, but to engage with currents and philosophies that come from elsewhere in order to create a more democratic, egalitarian way of thinking. Of course, these are anachronistic words that I'm using. So when we think about a new history, we have to ask ourselves, what are the ways in which we can understand a national history in terms of the multiple influences that are present in it, the multiple influences that come from within the space that we imagine within the map. Right? So we cannot understand the history of Indian culture without the history of Islam, without the history of Christianity, without the history of Judaism. And similarly, we can't understand the histories of India without the histories of people who moved out into the ocean and come back again, like Swami Achitanand. For him, it is that fundamental experience of freedom that he experiences in the US, right, working as an agricultural laborer in California, that he brings back to Punjab, which has, as you know, a significant number of Dalits, leading to the formation of the Dalit movement. So I think to move away from these cliches where we see landscapes created by invasion and landscapes created through peace, the preservation of culture and the destruction of culture, we have to ask ourselves, how are we to understand the very idea of culture? Right? That culture, it is through this flow and through this miscegenation, the prevalence of dialogue and confrontation. And so it's important to remember, even when you think about somebody like Ambedkar, Ambedkar is preceded by Jyotiba Phule. Jyotiba Phule in 1873 writes the book Gulamgiri, right? And Gulamgiri is dedicated to the former slaves of the United States. Right? Suddenly, what you have is an imagination of an identity that is Indian, but connected across the ocean to a landscape of equality. Right? And so these are the kinds of ways in which we need to think about Indian history, where we have to think about ways in which a hierarchical, inegalitarian landscape comes to be informed through the movement of people, through the influence of religion, and is infused with notions of what it is to be human and to relate to each other as human. It's not a precise answer to the question, but I hope you will think with what I have said. Umang Gupta, and then Subrata.
Sir, can I ask my question in Hindi?
जरूर पूछिए. हिंदी आती है मुझे, वैसे तो मैं केरल से हूँ, पर आपको तो मलयालम नहीं आती होगी.
नो सर. आपने किया था सर. गदर पार्टी 1913 में उसका स्थापना हुआ था सर. उन्होंने पहला जो उसका सभा किया था सर, उसका जो स्लोगन था, अंग्रेजों के खिलाफ हथियार उठाना कोई धर्म महायुद्ध है सर, कोई मतलब पाप नहीं है सर. तो सर अभी के प्रेजेंट टाइम में देखा है तो अगर ऐसा कुछ होता है किसी देश या किसी संस्था के खिलाफ, ऐसा कोई मतलब भड़काऊ अगर कोई विचार लिए जाते हैं तो सर उसको खिलाफ कार्रवाई की जाती, तो क्या सर उसमें ऐसी कार्रवाइयां नहीं होती थी सर?
तो how does this relate to what I have said? I mean, how does this relate to the lecture that I've just given? आपने जो प्रश्न पूछा, तो ये
सर,
मैंने जो लेक्चर दिया था उससे क्या ताल्लुक है?
सर आपने बोला था कि गदर पार्टी जैसे नेशनलिज्म के मतलब उसमें जुड़ाव किया है आपने सर. तो सर मैं ये बोल रहा हूँ कि सर उसमें अगर उन लोगों का जो पहला जो मीटिंग हुआ था कैलिफोर्निया में सर, उन्होंने एक स्लोगन दिया था सर फर्स्ट मीटिंग का. वो था कि अंग्रेजों के खिलाफ शस्त्र उठाना महायुद्ध. तो सर अगर प्रेजेंट टाइम में देखा जाए तो ऐसा अगर स्लोगन भड़काऊ दिया जाता है शस्त्र उठाने का, तो सर उसको उस संस्था के खिलाफ कोई कार्रवाइयां की जाती हैं, क्योंकि किसी देश के खिलाफ आप ऐसे कोई विचार नहीं रख सकते. तो सर क्या उसमें ऐसा नहीं होता था?
No, of course. I mean, I think if you raise a slogan that is against the state, regardless of whether it's the imperial state or the national state, right, their reactions are going to be very similar, right? That of putting you into jail, because the state sees itself as the only legitimate entity, right? And democracy is created on the principle that people elect their representatives to a parliament, and that these people in parliament are meant to serve the people and to serve democracy. But there is a way in which the state becomes the expression of democracy, and the state's violence becomes the expression of that democracy. So just as much as the Gadar party was seen as something that opposed the colonial state, any attempt to actually speak about the possibility of widening or deepening democracy through questioning inequality, through questioning hierarchy in India will be seen with suspicion by the state. So things haven't changed very much, right? And that's the irony, right? It's the nationalists who worship the map that the colonials colonialists gave them, and the nationalists continue with the state and the laws that the colonial government gave them as well. This is something that a lot of historians have worked on, that much of what we see as a criminal procedure code, much of what we see as the law and order structures are largely from the colonial government. So when the Indian Constitution was promulgated in 1950, it incorporates the Government of India Act of 1935, right? That's one of the fundamental, it comprises a large proportion. So it's not a matter of surprise that colonial governments and national governments should not be very different in the ways in which they respond to challenges to their authority. Subrata?
Dilip, I am going to let go of my question. I'll get a chance. There are other, I think, students who want to ask, so I'm going to let them.
No, but there is time, I think. No, Abhishek, what do you say?
I'll come back to it.
Yes,
Don't
sir.
worry. Let others ask. Let others. Abhishek,
Okay,
others
Vivek?
can ask.
Yes, Vivek, you can ask.
Vivek?
Good afternoon, sir. Because my mic was muted, so that's why I didn't able to ask you. So my question is belongs to this South Indian region with respect to Kerala. Why oceans are not associated with the history as by in the terms of history nearby citizens with the respect of Kerala, which you have started in starting your lecture. You have mentioned about the book on Kerala. Could you reframe the statement, please? I didn't understand the part.
Sorry, just ask again, please. I mean, I didn't quite. What do you want me to clarify?
Sir, actually, I want to clarify what is the history of Kerala with regards to ocean, because you said oceans are not associated with the history. Is it your statement?
No. What I said was that in the literary and aesthetic sensibility of Kerala, the ocean appears to be absent. But once I began reading more and I spoke about those three figures, Balakrishna Pilla, Padmanabha Menon, and so on, I saw how when they began writing a history of Kerala, they wrote with a much larger geography, right? And a much longer history. So Balakrishna Pilla began his history of Kerala with Rome, Padmanabha Menon began with Holland, Kanipayur began with Central Asia. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. That's the point I want to ask.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Then there are some questions in the chat box. May I just look at those?
Yes, sir.
Shailendra Jha has asked the question, what was the impact of Southeast Asian countries on Indian culture? Now, this is something I must admit I'm not much of an expert on. I mean, the reverse is something that I could speak about, right? But as to the impact of Southeast Asia on Indian culture, this is, I think if you'll forgive me, my apologies, I don't think I have an answer to this question. Then Vivek asks why oceans are not associated with South Indian region in terms of history with respect to Kerala region.
So you just answered his question.
Oh, right. I just answered his question. And Ankur says, good webinar. So thank you, Ankur. Then Muhammad Rahmatullah, in what ways can the history of religious interactions in pre-colonial India be understood within the perspective of Oceanic studies? This is a wonderful question because I think I addressed this when I spoke about Indian Ocean Islam and the fact that many of the religions that we know in southern India have come to us from elsewhere, right? And that there are these interactions that produce newer manifestations and newer spirit within an existing landscape. So it's very difficult to imagine any of these, what we see as indigenous religions, without the dialogue and the interaction with religions that come from elsewhere. So if even one thinks about Kerala, It's very difficult to think about Hinduism in Kerala without its ongoing dialogues with Islam and with Christianity. Right? And that all of these religions have managed to become, over a period of time, more democratic while retaining certain inherent inegalitarianisms. It's not as if there is no caste in Kerala, but it's been modified over a period of time through these dialogues that emerge. Similarly, when one thinks about the emergence of the Bhakti movement in northern India, it's difficult to imagine the Bhakti movement emerging without that dialogue that emerges with Islam, between Islam and Hinduism. And now there's a lot of work which is being done on the Mughal court, for example, which shows the engagement of the Mughal court with Sanskrit literature. So Supriya Gandhi's work, Rahul Nayar's work, looking at particularly the figure of Dara Shikoh, for example, that even in the Mughal court, what you have is this emerging dialogue, not only between religions, but between languages, right? So Sanskrit is one of the languages present in the Mughal court with which intellectuals engaged. So I think this is something that we need to understand when we begin to think about Hindu, Muslim, all of these as being kind of hermetically sealed entities, right? These are entities that are always in dialogue, sometimes in conflict, but out of that emerges a third kind of entity, right, which emerges out of that conflict and that conversation. And this is a more fruitful way of understanding interaction between cultures and human beings rather than merely understanding it through histories of violence. So for me, one of the more interesting books that was by my former colleague at Delhi University, Shahid Amin, where he talked about this cult in northern India, where you have the fact of these invasions that happen, right? But the nephew of Mahmud of Ghazni becomes an object of worship, right? A Ghazi Miah becomes an object of worship for the Ahirs. How does that happen? See, violence happens, people live on beyond that violence. Violence also produces dialogue. This is not to say that violence is necessary, but we have to think beyond the histories of violence to what, because it is not as if human beings living side by side are hugely invested in resolving their conflicts through killing one another. We know this not to be true. Killing does happen, but people live on beyond that violence and create newer forms of living together, newer imaginations. And I think those are the kinds of questions that actually interest me as a historian. The way in which there is a longer process. We don't concentrate on particular moments, Muslim invasions, partition. How do people live on beyond that? And we know that people live on beyond that, right? And create newer forms of living together. And this is the important thing for us to think with in history. There's a question here from Mohammad Rahmatullah from Jamia Millia. I'm working on religious interactions and encounters in pre-colonial India. My theme of doctoral research is on the Pranami Sapranati. Look forward to the results of your research. I think more work needs to be done along these lines, which speaks about violence and dialogue at the same time. See, there was a way in which I think not so long ago when I was at school and at college, we tended to speak only about syncretism, right? Where we talked about spaces in which Hindus and Muslims interacted with each other through dialogue, through harmony, and so on. And we tended to leave aside the history of violence. And increasingly, in a time where India is being provoked to violence between communities, I think we need to ask the question, what are the ways in which we need to start to live together besides violence and beyond violence? Violence will always be a part of our life. And only those of us who have been privileged enough not to experience violence can afford not to think about violence, right? When you think about the Hindu society, Hindu society is a ribbon society. People don't even marry one another. Right? They marry only within their subcaste and they go through this, that, and the other. The value of the life of a Dalit is it's protected by the law, but it's worth nothing. And here again, an anecdote is important. I taught at the University of Hyderabad, which is in the Telangana region. And a lot of you are familiar with the histories of the Dalit movement or the Ambedkar movement in Hyderabad. A lot of you know of the story of Rohit Vemula, right? When I taught at the University of Hyderabad, it was a teaching moment for me because I realized that the classrooms that I was used to in Delhi, where I could be oblivious, right? Like a lot of people say, मैं नहीं जानता था कि मेरे class में कौन था, Hindu थे, Musliman थे, Dalit थे, where it is a kind of willful ignorance of the fractures within the class, that not everybody is equal, not everybody is treated equally. And when I taught at Hyderabad, the most important thing that I learned was in a moment of interaction where I was speaking with a student and I reached across to pat him on the shoulder and he moved away. And he moved away because he said that, look, where I come from, I come to university, I have to constantly remember that I'm a Dalit. I let you touch me, I get used to that touch. I go back to my village and I touch somebody, I get killed. Right? This is the India that we live in. And this is the India that we need to know about in our histories. We study many abstractions in our histories, right? We study social and economic process, we study land revenue settlements, but fundamentally we need to understand that there is something about the dignity of the human being that we don't engage with in our classrooms. What do we know of the 80 others in the classroom? What do we know about their lives? Right? We work with this illusion and the delusion that we all lead the same lives. But the ways in which we study history have to be informed by this presence of this constant diversity, constant violence around us, and the constant need for dialogue to transcend that. So even getting land and water in conversation reminds us that there are histories that we don't know about. But anyway, that's a long bhashan. I'll stop there. Thank you. Suvrita, there's still time for your question. Please do ask.
It's okay. I'll get my chance. Don't worry.
Now we're done with our questions.
I think all the questions have been answered. Oh, there are 2 new messages. Yes, and Ankur Majumdar, thank you for that reference. I mean, the reference to Shekhar Bandyopadhyay's work. It's very, very interesting that in Bengal, the idea was that there was no caste, right? Until Shekhar Bandyopadhyay began writing his books on the Namashudras. And I mean, I mean this as a joke, then he was exiled to New Zealand thereafter. Right? Yeah. And we have, recently we have had a book edited by Uday Chandra, which again brings up this question of why caste is not spoken about very much in Bengal. Bengal is largely understood through the history of the Bhadralok. And it is the Bhadralok who have written the history of Bengal. So it's really been a history of themselves. It's a very narcissistic history. And Shekhar was the first person to actually remind us that there were in English language literature. There's a lot of Bengali works which Hitesh Ranjan, Shonnal and people have written about this earlier, but in English, Shekhar Bandyopadhyay was the first one to speak to us about the existence of caste in Bengal. Yasser. Okay, there's a long question from Yasser. One of the things you overlook when writing the history of India is the role of water bodies. The everyday lives of Indians are shaped by water, from water gods to waterborne diseases. One of the observations I could make from your lecture is the possibility that nation and nationalism could be imagined from the ocean. That's true. The ocean is also about openness, fluidity, unpredictability. I couldn't have put it better. I believe that oceanic regions and communities are more receptive to ideas of reform than our landlocked ideas. all of this is true. Thank you very much for this long and detailed comment, Yasser. I completely agree with you. Though as to whether regions connected with the ocean are more open to ideas, that remains to be seen, because I think one of the interesting things is that even when one thinks about the idea of a certain kind of cosmopolitanism and openness to ideas, it may be true of people who live along the coast, but the coast has an hinterland, and that hinterland is connected to an interior. And so probably there are two worlds along the coast, one which is open to a larger world of ideas and fluidity and motion, and another which is more tied in with ideas of hierarchy and so on. Because even when one thinks about the east coast of Africa, I had this interview, done this interview with Abdul Razak Gurna, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature this year, and he writes about the Swahili coast. And he says that when you talk about cosmopolitanism on the eastern coast of Africa, it's restricted to 30 kilometers along the coast. And the interior has another history. And so it is this that we have to remember, that we need not go overboard in our understanding of oceanic sites as being wholly cosmopolitan. Right? But thank you for that comment. I found it's an excellent summary. Are there any more questions?
No, sir.
Saroj Kumari. Yes, Saroj Kumari, even mountainous regions have a cosmopolitan culture, and this is the work that's been done by William Van Schendel, James Scott, which looks at the northeast of India, that's the, Mizoram, Nagaland, Manipur, all of those states as part of Zumia, or part of North Asia, as much as part of Burma and Malaya, and a culture that arises out of a conversation and dialogue that emerges in that larger space. Now, as I said, this map is something that inhibits our imagination. When we think Kashmir to Kanyakumari, Gujarat to the Northeast, we forget what Fernand Braudel reminded us of, that if we think outwards from the margins, we are aware of much larger histories. Right? Abhishek, now you have to take charge and tell me what to do.
Nothing to do, sir, basically. Subita ma'am will propose a vote of thanks, and that will be the last ritual of this program. So.
That's fine. But so thank you for the opportunity to speak with all of you. Thank you for the questions. And thank you for your patience that 93 people have stayed on.
Thank you so much. Our student introduced Professor Menon as the first speaker in the series, or speaker in the series of eminent historians. And I must say, it gives an immense pleasure to thank a friend who then is coming on the podium as eminent speaker. It's a matter of great pride. Dalit has been someone who has always been very curious and who always, in some senses, created a disquiet always by talking about the voice from the south. Main kaha hoon, mera kya hoga? What about me? Yes, that was very much a part of Dalit as a student and now. So thank you, Dalit. As I thought, okay, I didn't have really a question. I had certain observations, and since I had to thank you in any case formally, I thought I'll speak here. And I was deeply struck by two things. I thought it was not just a lecture on nation and nationalism, but it was a lecture on going beyond nation and nationalism. It was a wonderful, wonderful rendition, I would say, on trying to see that when we talk about elements, water and earth, what do they signify to us? And there is something about that, land has created a certain tension about being rooted, about not just belonging, but appropriating, claiming, creating, I am the son of the soil, I'm this and that, the patrimony. Water, on the other hand, is reminding us about fluidity.
Right.
Water is telling us about something that cannot be tamed. And I think in that sense, seeing history from that point of view also helps us understand that so much of our history is how we, from which point of view we are seeing and which point of view we are trying to capture. And water really, I'm not saying that, as you mentioned, water is not necessarily egalitarian, but water is something which does talk about sharing and caring in a manner, because water makes you vulnerable, in a manner in which the midst of an ocean, vulnerable, you are, and you pick up on things, you survive. And when you survive by taking whatever is available. So then water enables us to take on traditions, on cultures, a richness that comes because you understand the essence of life differently. I think, Dilip, it is a very strong case you have made and a wonderful case you have made for us to go beyond these very set patterns of understanding our own past and seeing it in different ways, which will enrich us in our present also so much more. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. May I sign off now? May I leave now?
Sir, 1 second, sir. Kindly, faculty members, kindly put on your camera for a picture. Yes, sir. Salanda, you can click the picture. Done.
My cat also wants to be in the picture.
Yeah, sure, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, sir.
A pleasure. Thank you. And hopefully we'll all have the opportunity to meet each other face to face at some point.
Absolutely.
Thank you so
Whenever
much.
you'll be here in India next time.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye, sir. Thank you, sir. Ma'am, should I end the meeting?
Yes, let's just thank you all.
Thank you, ma'am. One second. Our next talk is on 15th, and Professor Hanglu will deliver the lecture on Kashmir in Contemporary Perspective. Thank you so much.